Well, my name is Patrick Travers. I'm from Ottawa, Canadian. My affiliation at the moment is I work in the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Sure. I think we can differentiate between the general challenges that all the various different conflict prevention methodologies face, and then some of the more specific challenges that are unique to particular methodologies. So at the general level, it's true that it's easier to assess underlying risk than it is to predict exactly when that risk will escalate into a particular crisis. So there's a question about timely and accurate warnings. The other challenge is, it's important not to miss a crisis, but it's also important not to cry wolf. So there's this question of false positives, which ultimately are quite damaging for an early warning mechanism. If you're constantly predicting a crisis that never occurs, decision makers and policymakers eventually stop paying attention. There's another practical challenge, which is combating received wisdom. So if your early warning tool, your assessments are simply replicating the watch list that policymakers have in their minds at all times, then you tend to get ignored as well. So the challenge is, can you kind of confront some received wisdom? Can you point to crises that aren't being considered? And can you identify crisis at an earlier stage? So can you really drive a reconsideration of the way in which the actor concerned is approaching a particular situation? And the fourth general challenge has to do with understanding local threats, local dynamics, and this is a kind of current problem. The sense that if you want to look at the earliest signs of conflict, of risk, you need to really look at the community level, the district level in particular states, and that requires a really deep understanding of the context. It requires, you need to understand the language, you need to understand informal ways in which the society manages its own disputes, and that's just an enduring capacity challenge, whether you're doing this at a quantitative level or a qualitative level. Now, there are more specific limitations to each methodology you might apply. The quantitative methods that look back at various data sets to try to understand structural factors of risk, to try to predict which countries are most at risk, are hugely effective, but they depend on the data that's available. So that data might have time lags, it might be missing for particular countries, and it also might miss some new and emerging threats. So to give you a concrete example, we have really good data on state-led mass killing, which is very useful for understanding genocide. It's not so useful for understanding the threat posed by non-state actors like Boko Haram and ISIS. On the qualitative side, conflict analysis, early warning conducted by country experts can give you a very comprehensive picture of what's happening, but it depends on the information you have available, it depends on bias, and it really depends on the quality of the expert involved. And this is, so I think this is a general rule of thumb, that no matter what methodology you use, there are going to be some shortcomings. And it's actually a really exciting time for this field, particularly because technological developments have allowed us to explore different options. So we have organizations that are networking groups of experts to conduct forecasting pools, which is really exciting because you can target specific risks that wouldn't be captured otherwise. You'll have organizations that are doing social media scanning as a way of tracking real-time trends. And then you have early warning systems that are doing things like linking community activists with cell phones to watch centers in capitals that give you, again, a real-time sense of how events are developing on the ground, which is really useful around electoral-based violence. But the bottom line is really there's benefits and shortcomings to everything. So if you want a comprehensive approach to conflict prevention and early warning, you need to employ multiple methodologies and you need different sources of information and data. Rwanda was the spur that led to a huge development in new capacity for early warning. And the important thing to remember about Rwanda is that there were warnings. It wasn't a surprise. But those warnings were relatively isolated. So the most famous of them, of course, is General Dallaire's cable in 1994, which went unheeded and untransmitted within the UN. But there were others. The CIA did an analysis that predicted a worst-case scenario that had hundreds of thousands of casualties in Rwanda. But none of this sort of added together into a comprehensive analysis of what the nature of the crisis might be. And particularly in the early stages, the challenge was overcoming this frame of Rwanda being a civil war. And only as it became absolutely clear that this was genocide did then the international community change the way in which it approached the situation. So warning was present, but it wasn't systematic, and it wasn't sufficient to really inform decision makers, particularly in the Council, on exactly the nature of the crisis. And I think it's also important to remember here that that information was inequitably distributed. So particularly in the Security Council, which is playing a key role in responding to Rwanda, some members had a much better idea of what was happening on the ground than others. And that allowed for particular members to adjust the way in which the Council responded. So how well are things working now? As I mentioned at the outset, there's been a tremendous growth of early warning capacity, and that's very good news. So, within the UN, there are new mechanisms. The office I work in has been established partly as a reaction to Rwanda, but also Bosnia and other situations of mass atrocities. The African Union has a continental early warning system that ties together early warning systems in all the various sub-regions of Africa. The EU has early warning dedicated capacity, and the same is true of member states. We see a host of civil society actors providing really excellent early warnings, so we can think of International Crisis Group, but also Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So what we've done essentially is changed a sort of unreliable flow of information for now, frankly, a glut of information. So the challenge has come, the challenge has now shifted. And now what we need to do is find the signal in the noise. It's about sifting through all of this information to find the key points that really do predict that a crisis is coming. The other thing that's been a bit disappointing is that this growth in capacity hasn't necessarily yielded the action that we might have hoped. So too many early warning mechanisms are not strongly linked enough to decision making. And early warning really is about generating action. And so if you keep issuing warnings, and then that doesn't lead to a difference in response, then there is a fundamental failure. And that's a huge institutional problem at the moment. And then finally, I think there's scope for better coordination between the various mechanisms that exist. There's all sorts of good reasons why it's difficult to share information and analysis, from confidentiality to the fact that many of these tools fill very particular institutional needs. But the reality is that the global capacity for early warning is not as linked up as it could be. So the issue now is really, very rarely do you hear policymakers say, a crisis occurred and we didn't know it was coming. The challenge is there were warnings, but there were warnings amongst a whole variety of other warnings, and we weren't able to mobilize the rapid action or the early action necessary to prevent it. So we've sort of exchanged one set of problems for another, but we're certainly much better off than we were in 1994 with the Rwandan genocide. You can look to the events in the Central African Republic, which had some alarming similarities to the Rwandan genocide. But you have the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide in the UN warning the Security Council. You have regular warnings from other members of the UN and from the Special Political Mission present. So, the difference is certainly in New York, as that crisis approached, there is no question that there was an understanding of the potential dimensions of the crisis. So we know much more than we did. And this is a very interesting question, crisis and pluralism. I think the kind of worst and logical endpoint for this, the sorts of issues that my office works on, which is serious human rights violations or atrocity crimes committed against groups on the basis of their identity, whether that's cultural or religious or ethnic, linguistic or otherwise. And I think that's a very useful frame for understanding the very late stage of exclusion, when patterns of discrimination have led, for various reasons, to an outbreak of violence. The good news is that we have a growth of tools that are very, very focused on these sets of issues. So there is capacity being mobilized there. The question is, how do we kind of move further upstream to the earlier stages? And I might come back to that as I address the timing question. In terms of understanding risk, our understanding of the various risk factors associated with this type of violence has improved dramatically in the last 15 years. It's partly a product of really strong academic research. It's also a product of sustained policy investment in these issues as well. And when thinking about risk, we really need to think about two different types of risk. We need to think about, first, structural risk, which are the kind of features in a society that predispose it towards exclusion, towards particularly the types of exclusion that might escalate into worst case types of group violence. And so here, A key indicator is, frankly, the presence of armed conflict and political instability, or a previous experience with this type of serious exclusion, which then we know leads to raised risks of relapse back into conflict of various sorts. We also know, for example, that weak state capacity in particular areas is a huge challenge, and we can think of state capacity to promote and respect human rights, state capacity in the justice sector, ensuring that there's equitable access and fair justice, but also in a few more specific areas. So it turns out that state capacity to manage and resolve local tensions and local disputes is particularly important. So we can look to societies and see where they have an ability to manage escalating risk and where they don't. And those that don't are predisposed to see some negative consequences. At the dynamic side, it's important to understand the type of factors that can take a situation of latent risk and then lead to an elevation. And there it's really about understanding the motives, the incentives, and the capacity of various actors to either to strengthen patterns of exclusion or to mobilize existing grievances between groups for political purposes. So often what we're talking about is political elites and the kinds of decisions they are making. And then critically, we need to focus on the kinds of things that can trigger these kinds of escalations. So an obvious example is a sudden change in regime. But anything that shifts some kind of balance of political power, the distribution of benefits within a society, has the potential to trigger negative consequences. And so we need to be particularly focused about those moments where a society can either escalate into crisis or can manage in one way or another to avoid the worst possible outcomes. And then finally, back to the question of timing that you raised. I mean, the simple answer is really we need early warning and early action as early as possible while still being credible. We can't act everywhere and at all times, but the earlier the better, and that's an enduring challenge. A slightly more technical response is, if you're thinking of an early warning system, the timing also needs to be tailored to the types of tools that it's intended to activate. So if you're conducting early warning that's feeding into kind of development planning cycles, then you need to be a little bit earlier than if you're looking at rapid deployment of mediation, for example. So it needs to be a bit tailored for the institutional context. When we talk about these structural risks, it's long-term change. We're talking about generational patterns here. And one of the really interesting things one of the really important things that we need to better understand is why some societies with these latent risks are able to manage them better than others. And particularly, I mean, we can see societies that have very similar risk profiles, but really dramatically different reactions to various shocks. And there's some exciting research that's happening now on trying to pick apart what exactly is it about those societies. Where does the resilience to these forms of exclusion come from? But frankly, we don't know enough about it yet. I mean, it is, and I think for three reasons. The first, sort of most basically, civic exclusion is a really negative social dynamic no matter where it's present. I mean, it has pernicious effects on society as a whole, but it also directly disadvantages individuals on arbitrary grounds of identity. So we need to be concerned about it no matter where it is. The second reason is we really need to be careful not to be complacent. And here, I think history and the painful experience with atrocity crimes is a useful sort of cautionary guide. We know that genocide and other forms of atrocity crimes have occurred in all regions of the world and at all levels of development. So it's a mistake to think that a particular society is immune from the negative consequences of persistent patterns of civic exclusion. And the final reason is frankly, in today's world, national patterns of exclusion, persistent discrimination of groups, it has consequences beyond borders. And so we need to think a little bit more carefully about how some of these exclusionary ideologies are affecting multiple countries and are crossing regions. I mean, the obvious example now is, you see the links between Boko Haram and ISIS, you see the flow of foreign fighters into Syria and Iraq. So the answer is, if we were to manage globally our diversity, then a big part of that puzzle has to do with promoting pluralism at a national level. And so to understand that dynamic, we really need to have a global perspective. Absolutely. I think for practitioners, there's a general rule of thumb that situates a sort of a trade-offs between early action and late action, or early warning and late warning. And the earlier you try to provide warning, generally speaking, the more general the risks are, the harder it is to be very specific about the warning you're provided. But at the same time, it's much lower cost for action. You're trying to engage in situations where a little bit of support or a nudge might help actors change their trajectory. And generally speaking, not always true, but generally speaking, the political sensitivities involved around those conversations are much lower. The later you go in the process, it becomes much clearer that a crisis is imminent or may potentially occur. So the warning is much better, but the costs for action are much higher. The kinds of policy options you're applying, the worst possible end of the spectrum when we talk about peacekeeping or other forms of force, they're costly, they're less effective, and the politics are much more complicated. So one of the challenges now, particularly in a situation where we really are facing overstretch in terms of the global capacity to manage crisis, is how we shift the balance upstream, how we engage earlier in early warning. There's an early action, and there's a number of reasons why that's difficult. It's much harder to track the impact you're having when you're engaging early. Prevention is notoriously challenging because if you do a good job, you get no credit and nobody knows you've succeeded. And that creates institutional incentives to focus resources elsewhere. But the costs of crisis are simply enormous, not just in human and political terms, but also in economic terms, and they stem beyond borders. So the balance we have now between investment in prevention and investment in response is really not smart policy, and it's not smart investment. So that's why we really need to invest in moving much sooner and much earlier. We know a lot more than we used to, which is very good news. And here, we can talk about, again, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of structural and dynamic risks. Genocide and other forms of atrocity crimes are very closely associated with armed conflict and political instability, but not exclusively so, and that's an important thing to remember. There's situations like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, which is not an armed conflict, and is stable in a negative sense, but is experiencing atrocity crimes, as a commission of inquiry recently concluded. So there's a strong correlation there, but not an exclusive one. We know that patterns of serious human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law is a strong predictor for genocide and other forms of atrocity crimes. We know intergroup tensions, obviously, is a strong predictor. And here, really any persistent pattern of discrimination, whether economic, social, or political, that falls along group cleavages is a huge source of concern. I mentioned weak capacity in an earlier answer, and I think that's true as well for genocide. The degree to which a state is interconnected in its region or the broader economy also plays a role, as it changes the incentives of actors involved. And in dynamic terms, really, again, it's understanding motives, incentives, capacity to commit. Genocide's a very hard thing to actually undertake, so capacity is an important piece of this. Identifying when actors who have the intent to commit genocide are actually capable of undertaking it. And then it's very difficult, but it's very important, but trying to identify those who really do have that intent to destroy in whole or part a group. So in general, we've come a very long way in the last 15 years. And that's really enabled us to build more robust responses to preventing and responding to atrocity crimes, and really have a much better picture of the kind of risks we face. I think it teaches us a few important lessons. One is that we should never be complacent about the consequences of civic exclusion, that allowing these kinds of pernicious patterns to develop in a society builds up risks that that we will have serious consequences down the road. So we need to be paying very close attention to the longer term trajectory of societies. It reinforces the need to act early. Acting late is incredibly difficult, so we need to invest in prevention, as I mentioned earlier. It really is smart policy. And then finally, we need to commit over the long term. It requires sustained international energy and support, and that sustained support will come at times when it's not driven by immediate crisis. So we need to have the ability to invest even when it's slightly less obvious that that investment is required.